Everything they told you about the barbarians is probably wrong. For centuries, we were taught that the Germanic people were nothing but raging, filthy, and brutal savages. But what if I told you that behind the unkempt beards and wooden shields lay a rich, complex, and spiritual civilization that, believe it or not, even had a more democratic vibe than many modern governments? That's right. The barbarians, so named by the Romans out of sheer imperial arrogance, had codes of honor, popular assemblies, leaders chosen on merit, and even restorative justice practices that today would be considered progressive. Yet all of that was swept away from the official history, hidden between the lines of manuscripts, silenced by the victors and ignored in classrooms. The true legacy of the Germanic tribes was lost to time, until now. In this video, you're going to discover how these people shaped Europe, challenged empires, and kept alive an identity that still pulses in our veins today. And you don't have to be a historian to get it. I'm here to guide you on this journey like a friend, sharing a precious secret in an honest chat. Get ready. You'll never look at barbarians the same way again. Legend has it that among dense forests, icy rivers, and eternal mists, the first echoes of what would later be called the Germanic tribes were born. They weren't grand empires or marble cities. They were rustic, fierce clans with a visceral connection to the land they trod. They lived north and west of the Rhine and Danube rivers, where the cold was unforgiving and survival was an art form. The Romans, naturally, were a bit suspicious. They called them barbarians, perhaps because they couldn't understand their codes, or maybe out of fear of what they couldn't control. Tacitus, one of the few Romans who tried to describe them, without so much prejudice, wrote a work called Germania, where he revealed more than the Romans were ready to accept. They were a people who didn't ask permission to exist. Each Germanic tribe had its own customs, but they shared values such as honor, loyalty to the clan, and disdain for any sign of weakness. They lived in small communities scattered throughout the forests, far removed from Roman glamour. And honestly, they weren't interested in that glamour at all. Pride was a weapon, just like the axe. But don't be fooled into thinking they were simply wild people yelling in the woods. There was wisdom there, passed down from elder to grandchild, from warrior to apprentice. Despite the image of uncultured savages that Rome sold to the world, these tribes had their own logic, an organization that surprised anyone who took the time to look closer. They had leaders, councils, alliances, and even ceremonies that would make any Roman politician break out in a cold sweat. Sure, there were conflicts and plenty of them, but there was also unity when a common danger loomed. And little by little, these peoples began to cross borders, not as random invaders, but as pieces on a board that Rome thought it controlled. The Romans, so accustomed to their own grandeur, underestimated these barbarians. They believed their wall was enough to keep the Germanic peoples at bay, but no one can hold back the wind, and the tribes knew how to move like it. What started as small skirmishes in remote villages gradually turned into a strategic dance between two worlds, one of marble and the other of wood and blood. Borders ceased to be barriers and became blurred lines defined by exchanges, conflicts, and alliances. These origins, though shrouded in mystery, reveal much about the soul of the Germanic tribes. They weren't born to follow rules. They were born to question those who imposed them. Their first steps in history weren't taken in pursuit of glory, but to claim a space where they could live as they saw fit. And in that quest, they began to shape something that many today ignore, the beginning of a new order forged in the clash between worlds. Now, if you found all this intriguing, just wait until you learn where the language that united these peoples came from. Even before they were called Germanic tribes, these peoples already carried with them an invisible yet powerful legacy: language. It wasn't just any dialect tossed to the wind, it was a language with deep roots embedded in the Pontic steppe, where the ancient Yamnaya rode like lords of a nascent world. They were the great sowers of what we now call the Indo-European languages, and the Germanic peoples, of course, drank straight from that well. All of this long before the runes, the thundering gods, and the wars against Rome. This linguistic heritage didn't come in books or treatises. It was passed on by mothers, telling stories by the fireside, in war cries, in the songs of ancient rites. It was a living, ever-changing language, shaped by the climate, by hunts, and by conflicts with neighboring tribes. The sound of the words conveyed more than the words themselves, and even as centuries passed, that bond with the Yamnaya was never broken. It only transformed, as if each barbarian tribe were a musical score, playing its own variation of the same ancestral symphony. But don't think it was all linear, because history rarely is. As they migrated, the Germanic peoples blended sounds, absorbed influences, and created variations that would make any modern linguist lose sleep. The dialects multiplied like the branches of a crooked, vibrant tree. And yet, there was a common trunk, a core that remained steadfast even in times of chaos. That essence is what unites the peoples we call Germanic, the same verbal soul, even if expressed in 1,000 voices. It's fascinating to think that a people branded as barbarians by the Roman elite spoke with such complexity, isn't it? It reveals just how deceptive appearances can be, and how linguistic prejudice shaped narratives for centuries. What sounded strange to Roman ears was, in reality, a rich linguistic tapestry, ancient and laden with oral wisdom and tradition. And even without writing for a long time, these peoples knew how to preserve their histories in a way no piece of paper ever could. Over time, this language became a pillar of identity among the Germanic tribes, an invisible code that united them, even as they spread out across forests, mountains, and open fields. It was more than communication, it was a living culture, and that is also reflected in the way they lived, produced, and organized themselves. But as you'll see next, the way of life of these tribes went far beyond words. Everyday life among the Germanic tribes was a blend of simplicity and practical wisdom. No golden palaces or toga-filled forums. What you saw was hard-packed, earth, wooden houses, and people who knew how to make everything from the land. They lived in scattered villages, surrounded by dense groves and wild fields. They raised animals, grew barley, picked fruits, and hunted with the precision of those who know every rustle in the forest. It was an economy that ran on sweat and the rhythm of the seasons. The tribes were not a uniform block. There were confederations like the Suebi, who sometimes united and sometimes clashed, just like one big family, you know? Each clan had its peculiarities, but the sense of community was strong. Everything revolved around the collective, the we before me. Internal disputes, no matter how heated, usually gave way to cooperation when danger was at the door. And then, my friend, when the Germanic tribes united, it was best to clear out of the way. They valued freedom above all else. They didn't easily accept any form of external domination. That free spirit even reflected in how they produced and shared resources. There wasn't a market like the Romans, nor the clinking of coins. Exchanges were direct, based on trust and need. Those with game traded with those who had the harvest. And all of this was based on a code of honor that would make many modern moguls green with envy. The concept of wealth was different too. It wasn't about hoarding goods, but about keeping the tribes safe, well-fed, and united. The land was seen as a mother, not as property. This created an almost spiritual relationship with the environment, where every tree and every river held value. And even though life was tough, and it really was, there was a raw beauty in the way these barbarians related to the world around them. This singular organization was a direct reflection of the Germanic soul. every detail of daily life revealed, a philosophy that resisted the temptations and traps of Roman civilization. But behind all that agricultural and tribal life was something that pulsed even stronger: the warrior spirit. Because when peace ended and thunder approached, it was time for shields to speak louder. Make no mistake, behind the tranquility of the forests and the smell of wet earth, the blood of the Germanic tribes boiled with the spirit of combat. Being a warrior wasn't just a profession, it was a calling, almost a sacred destiny. From a young age, the young barbarian learned to wield a spear like learning to walk. It was more than self-defense, it was honor, it was identity. In a culture where respect was earned on the battlefield, fighting well was as eloquent as speaking well. Those who knew how to fight were truly heard. Leadership among the Germanic tribes wasn't granted by birth, but by merit in battle. Sure, there were kings, usually the sons of kings, but they only stayed on the throne if they demonstrated real courage in the face of the enemy. And here's an interesting detail. More than the crown, the true leader was the war chief, the one who protected, who inspired. It wasn't enough to give orders. You had to bleed alongside your people, and that created bonds stronger than any signed contract. The Germanic army was essentially an infantry force. Men fought with their feet planted in the mud, protected by round shields and throwing javelins that cut through the air like thunder. Few had armor, and those who did usually picked up scraps from an unlucky Roman. But don't be fooled. The lack of iron on their shoulders was made up for by an organized fury, native strategies, and an almost instinctive sense of battle. They fought as if they were part of the very earth, and war, for them, wasn't just about destruction. It was a way to maintain balance, to earn the tribe's respect, and also to intimidate enemies. The Germanic peoples didn't march in neat rows like the Romans. They advanced like a controlled storm. They shouted, banged their shields, invoked their gods, and made even the most seasoned legionary question his choices. It was a brutal performance, yes, but also deeply ritualistic. Between one campaign and the next, between harvest and skirmish, the warrior spirit was kept alive. It was a way of being, of walking, of looking at the world. And more than that, it was a silent code that united the barbarians among themselves. But society wasn't made up solely of spears and battles. There was something even more intriguing about how these peoples decided their laws, judged their peers, and ran the politics of the forest. Contrary to what many believe, the Germanic tribes didn't live in a chaotic anarchy. On the contrary, they had their own way of doing politics, and let me tell you, a lot of modern democracy could take a page from it. They held the famous things, popular assemblies, where anyone strong enough to hold a spear could participate. There were no togas or bureaucracy, but there was something sacred there, the voice of the people being heard over the clashing of shields. Now that was a meeting with real passion. These gatherings were much more than mere votes. They were decisive moments where the destinies of entire tribes were charted. Armed men, side by side, discussed laws, punishments, and alliances. And no one was just there for show. Everyone had the right to speak, to give their opinion, and to shout if necessary. The chiefs and priests held weight, of course, but they didn't rule alone. If the majority didn't agree, there was no deal. It was consensus, barbarian style. The priests played a key role in these assemblies. They weren't just spiritual leaders. They acted as mediators, peacemakers, and even judges. When two Germanic tribes were about to clash, it was often these men of faith who prevented bloodshed. They used ancient wisdom, signs from the gods, and a healthy dose of authority to keep order. And make no mistake, they could be as feared as the best warriors. Justice among the tribes wasn't about punishment by example, but about restoring balance. If someone committed a crime, the goal wasn't to hang or torture them, but to make amends with cattle, with labor, or through Family agreements. This logic prevented internal wars and reinforced community bonds. Life was too hard to waste energy on uncontrolled vengeance. And that made the system surprisingly effective, even without written codes or courtrooms. These open-air armed meetings showed that the Germanic tribes' sense of justice came from the people, from oral tradition and real-life experience. It was politics with the scent of the forest, with the sound of axes in the background, and it worked. And within that universe of faith, honor, and consensus, there burned an even deeper flame, devotion to the ancient gods who guided every decision, every battle, every harvest. And it's in that spiritual connection that we'll dive in now. The Germanic tribes didn't see the world as just a place to survive. They saw it as a sacred stage where invisible forces were always at work. Their gods didn't live in a distant heaven, but among the trees, in storms, in the cawing of crows flying over the fields. It was a visceral religiosity, present in every gesture, every battle, every harvest. And their pantheon, which later inspired Norse myths, already featured figures like an old one-eyed sage, a thunder god, and a warrior of justice. There were no stone temples or written dogmas. The sacred manifested itself in clearings, in lakes, in ancient moss-covered stones. It was there that the barbarians performed their rituals, made their offerings, and sometimes even carried out sacrifices. Yes, even human ones when the occasion demanded something more impactful. But before you wrinkle your nose, remember that for them, this was a way to maintain balance. It was an attempt to keep harmony with the invisible world that, for these Germanic tribes, was as real as the forest around them. Divination was part of everyday life. Want to know if the winter would be harsh? Watch the flight of the birds. Need to decide whether to go to war? Cast runes, talk to the gods, read signs in sacred animals. This connection with the spiritual wasn't something distant, reserved. For a few, it was part of everyone's life, from the warrior to the shepherd, from the elder to the child. Each person had their own way of interpreting the unseen world, and that united the tribe with a magical thread of belief. The priests and shamans, or whatever these spiritual guides were called, played a fundamental role. They were advisors to the chiefs, interpreters of the divine will, and sometimes the only ones capable of calming an entire people's temper. When the wind shifted or something strange happened, all eyes turned to them. And even if their words were shrouded in mystery, they were respected as truths coming from beyond. Spirituality was, at its core, the invisible glue of barbarian society. Between runes, visions, and thunder in the sky, the barbarians lived in constant dialogue with the unseen. It wasn't blind faith, it was a daily experience, woven into the very fabric of the Germanic way of life. And this connection, both gentle and brutal, influenced everything. Even the way they faced the mighty Romans when they finally clashed with the greatest empire in the world. If Rome thought it could simply ignore the barbarians of the forests, it was dead wrong. The first shock came around 120 BC when the Cimbri and Teutons, two very bold Germanic tribes, decided to migrate en masse. And migrating here wasn't just moving to a new neighborhood. It was crossing territories with everything: family, livestock, wagons, and shields. When they reached the gates of Rome, they didn't come with applause. They came head-on. The Romans, accustomed to dealing with organized and predictable foes, were baffled. The Germanic peoples fought in a different way, almost chaotically, but with a primitive force that was truly intimidating. And even with some Roman victories, like that of Marius, there was already a nagging suspicion. Those barbarians, who until then were just a footnote on the maps, had now become a real threat, and the tension only increased as new tribes approached the empire's borders. During Julius Caesar's campaigns, encounters with the Germanic tribes gained even more prominence. Caesar, with his usual vanity, recorded everything in detail, of course, always casting himself as the hero of the story. But behind the scenes, the Roman generals were trembling. It was difficult to fight an enemy that emerged from the shadows, attacked with fury, and then melted back into the forest as if it had never existed. It was like battling your own fear, but the pinnacle of that tension came with Arminius, a name that Rome would never forget. Educated by the Romans, this Germanic leader knew the enemy well, and it was precisely with that knowledge that he orchestrated one of the greatest humiliations in Roman history, the ambush in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD. 3 entire legions were wiped out. A massacre. And they say Emperor Augustus spent days repeating, "Quintilius Varus, return my legions." That episode was a turning point. Rome stopped dreaming of total conquest of Germania and began to accept that those barbaric tribes would not be easily tamed. And although the sword had spoken loudly, something started to emerge amid skirmishes and treaties, the possibility of a more strategic coexistence, because not every encounter needed to end on the battlefield. Despite the spears, shields, and epic ambushes, not everything between the Romans and the Germanic tribes was settled by brute force. Sometimes the good old "let's talk it out" came into play. Rome, always cunning, realized it could achieve a lot with gold and promises. It started using a classic tactic: divide and conquer. It stoked rivalries among barbarian tribes, made secret deals, and carefully chose who received gifts and who got silence. But don't think the barbarians were fools. The Germanic tribes knew how to take advantage of these Roman maneuvers. They accepted coins, weapons, fine fabrics, and of course wine, a whole lot of wine. In return, they offered slaves, furs, amber, and even warriors as mercenaries. This created a network of exchanges as strategic as any treaty carved in marble. And on top of that, it helped keep the peace, at least for a while. Over the years, nearly diplomatic relations emerged between barbarian chiefs and Roman generals. There were meetings, banquets, promises sworn under the gods. It was a relationship of convenience, where one eye was on the negotiation table and the other on the hilt of a sword. Some barbarians even learned Latin, wore togas, and sent their children to study in Rome. Others, of course, kept their distance and were wary of every shiny gift. This cultural exchange transformed both sides. The Romans began to adopt Germanic practices in their armies and even in their way of life on the frontiers. And the Germanic peoples in turn absorbed techniques, words, objects, and habits that soon spread among the tribes. It was as if the border between the two worlds was gradually dissolving, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of interest, sometimes just out of sheer curiosity. But the balance was fragile, because while Rome forged alliances with one tribe, others would show up at the door with swords drawn. And there was something coming from the east, an invisible pressure pushing the barbarians into new territories, something that would transform migration into invasion and redesign the map of Europe forever. Peace, if it ever existed, was fleeting. From the east, a shadow began to grow. Peoples even wilder, or at least more desperate, came in waves, pushing everything in their path. And in the midst of that historical shove, the Germanic tribes found themselves pressed against the Roman Empire like pieces in a giant domino game. It wasn't just migration, it was pressure, it was escape, it was survival. And things were about to spill over. Around 166 AD, the Marcomanni, a respected Germanic tribe, led a series of confrontations with Rome, marking the beginning of the Marcomannic Wars. This wasn't just any conflict. It was a symptom of something larger. The world was changing, and the barbarians knew it. The East kept spitting out new peoples like the Goths and later the feared Huns. Those who didn't move were crushed, and those who did sometimes were too. It was chaos. These movements weren't leisurely strolls. Imagine entire multitudes, men, women, children, animals, tents, everything, crossing forests and mountains in search of shelter. And where did they show up? At the Roman borders. But now, unlike before, they weren't just coming with war banners. They arrived with families, with hunger, with stories. And Rome, tired, corrupt, and overburdened, began to cave in. A little here, a little there. And the empire started to crack. The Germanic tribes were no longer just pesky neighbors. They became protagonists. They started settling inside Roman territory, fighting alongside Romans, even taking up military posts. What was once exclusive to the Roman elite was now shared, albeit reluctantly. And that changed everything. The barbarians were in the know, literally. And gradually, the line between invader and ally began to vanish. A new game was underway. This new phase wasn't just a chapter in history, it was the harbinger of the end of an era. The Western Roman Empire was already showing signs of fatigue, and the barbarians, once marginalized, were now at the center of the stage. It was the beginning of a new order, one where Germanic spears would decide the fate of kingdoms, cities, and civilizations. But that's a story for another time. Now that you know the true origins of the Germanic tribes, tell me, do you still think they were just barbarians? Or can you see the wisdom hidden behind wolf pelts and axes? History was written by the victors, but it's up to us to give voice to those who were silenced, and to understand how these peoples shaped far more than we ever imagined. Have you ever stopped to think that part of the way you are, the way you think, and even your rebellious streak against the system might have Germanic roots? Could it be that your thirst for freedom, your sense of justice, or that impulse to question authority, aren't they distant echoes of those ancient peoples? Now, with this knowledge, the question remains, what are you going to do with it? Will you let it pass as just another internet curiosity? Or will you dive even deeper into this fascinating universe and reclaim what was lost? If this story provoked you, made you reflect, or simply awakened a new perspective on the past, then go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next episodes. There's still so much to reveal, and believe me, we're just getting started.